Ozark taught me to change the world.
Ozark taught me to disciple kids.
Ozark taught me to teach the word.
Ozark taught me to communicate the truth.
Ozark taught me to teach.
Ozark taught me to preach.
Ozark taught me to preach the word.
Ozark taught me how to love people better.
Ozark taught me how to do community through Jesus in our area.
Ozark taught me to love God.
Ozark taught me to study the Bible on a deeper level.
Ozark taught me to lead others in worship of our King.
Ozark taught me to love the lost.
Ozark taught me to love Jesus more, to love his church more, and to lead his people better.
Growing up as a child, dealing with emotions like pain, sorrow, anger, and fear were actually a pretty difficult thing for me to do. I remember there's a song called Teach Me by an artist named Music So Child, and in it, he opens the song by saying this: "I was taught the true definition of a man was to never cry." And although I have grown and matured since I was a child, and I recognize that that's probably a really bad definition of what a man is, I still to this day can struggle with how I'm supposed to approach and to live life with emotions not just like happiness, but also sadness. This happens in serious moments and also in the not so serious moments of my life. In the serious moments, it's as I raise my own children, as they are dealing with their emotions of pain and sorrow, and I'm supposed to respond to that in an emotionally intelligent way. But also it happens like in not so serious moments. It happens like in trying to pick out a movie for the night. My family and I love to watch movies, but sometimes I choose certain movies based on how sad the movie is actually going to be. Every movie, at least most movies, are set up with a similar structure. They have like an ordinary world moment, things are going fine. Then you have the protagonist and they're trying to solve a problem. And then something bad really happens that almost causes failure and then redemption. Whenever my family and I are trying to think through a movie, I normally ask, what is that really bad moment in the movie? And do I really want to go through that right now? Do I want to watch that? Sometimes the answer is yes, because it's ultimately going to be a good thing and I'm willing to go through it. But to be honest, sometimes the answer is no. And although this is a serious or not so serious moment, I think we do have a serious issue in the American church of this thing that I want to call the Joker effect. It's this feeling that we put upon people that we cannot talk about the despair and the sorrow of our lives, but only about the good and the glorious times. I call it the Joker effect based off of the DC villain, like in the Batman or Dark Knight movies or comics. The Joker is this clown-looking person who always has a smile on his face, and yet ultimately, whenever you look into his eyes, you can tell that there's something deeply wrong. Evangelical church in the United States struggles with this Joker effect and dealing and responding and living life with these negative emotions. For example, I believe that we can look at our corporate worship settings and see how we struggle with these things. I just want to put 3 down here just as an example. When it comes to planning out our services, how much time do we dedicate to remembering the death of Jesus? As I've counted it in my different experiences, I'm going to say about 2 minutes is allotted to people actually spending time remembering Jesus' death and the agony that he went through. We know, for a second reason, we know that about 40% of our Psalms in the book of Psalms are Psalms of lament. And yet when it comes to the hymns of our churches, only about 15% of them can be considered hymns of lament. When it comes to contemporary Christian worship music, only about 5% of them can be considered songs of lament. There are entire books of the Bible that are entirely unpreached from. and unread like Obadiah and the other minor prophets simply because they're too negative. I think the church has been encultured, has been indoctrinated in a way to avoid lament, to avoid the despair, that we look at the beautiful, at the neglect of what people are going through in the midst of their pain. And though much of the church of the United States struggles with this is not something that our God struggles with. As you know, as you've entered into this session, we have an entire book in our Bible called the Book of Lamentations. And the Book of Lamentations demonstrates to us that we worship a God who does not go over lament, does not go over sorrow, but actually goes through sorrow. And so in this series, I want us to ask this question: what does the Book of Lamentations do for us as we are discipled? And at the end of the day, I believe Lamentations is in the business of making us look more like Jesus. The unapologetic statement of Lamentations is that we are not to avoid sorrow, but instead we must go through the sorrow, and that in going through the sorrow, we actually end up looking more like what God looks like. Of course, I want to get to that destination of what are we supposed to look like, but let us not skip the process. Let's go through the process and then get at the destination. Lamentations takes us through 3 different layers of the human experience. And what I want to do in this opening session is give an overview of the Book of Lamentations, how these 3 layers show up and pop up throughout the book, and then demonstrate why it's going to be important for us to know this as we go throughout each chapter in the Book of Lamentations. The first layer that we go through is going to be the physical. We can also call this layer the historical. It is very easy for someone to pick up the Book of Lamentations and to start reading it as if it's in a vacuum, as just a book of poetic tellings of despair and sorrow. But I don't want us to detach it from its physical context, from its historical context. You see, the Book of Lamentations is placed where it's at in our Old Testaments for a reason. It's placed right after the book of Jeremiah. And the reason why is that many people believe that Jeremiah actually wrote the Book of Lamentations, but more importantly, it's placed there because it comes after a significant event in the life of the Israelites, and that is the destruction of Jerusalem. The destruction of Jerusalem in the Old Testament would be like a modern day 9/11, that you mention the date and everyone already knows what you are talking about. This is actually the event in the Old Testament that would make me not want to watch it if it were a movie. But so many books of the Old Testament talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. You have books like 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and then of course, Lamentations comes and talks about the aftermath of the destruction of Jerusalem. And so as we talk about this physical layer, I just want us to know about the when, the why, and the how of the destruction of Jerusalem. First is the when. We believe, because of where Lamentations is placed, that the destruction of Jerusalem takes place at the end of Jeremiah's ministry. And so this is going to be placed around 586 BCE, whenever Jerusalem is destroyed by a conquering nation called Babylon. It is important to note that Lamentations is also part of a collection of books called the Megillat. Megillat just means 5 scrolls, which is a collection of 5 different smaller books of the Old Testament that are read throughout the Jewish calendar year. And so Lamentations is read during the time of the year when people remember in the synagogue when Jerusalem was destroyed by Babylon. It's important, though, to remember kind of the history leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. There's an important date before we get to 586, and that is 597. In 597 BC, we see Babylon come to Jerusalem to conquer it, and then Jerusalem decides actually to open up their gates and to surrender. In this moment, we start seeing names like Jehoiakim, Daniel, Azariah, Mishael, Hananiah, names that all show up in the book of Daniel. And so in 597, we see this first exile moment of people being taken from Jerusalem and being put into Babylon. But Jerusalem is left intact in this moment. In 597, there's exile, but Jerusalem is left. It's still able to operate, and Babylon puts another king in place, and that king being Zedekiah. A few years later, though, 11 years later, Zedekiah decides to rebel against Babylon. And this is when 586 takes place, where Babylon decides to come through and destroy Jerusalem. Jerusalem at its heyday had 25,000 people. Now, as a city, you might think that's actually kind of small for a city. I live in the city of Joplin, and right now it's about 50,000 people. So this is half of that. But in that time, 25,000 people in one space was a pretty big city. But after this first exile and then the destruction of Jerusalem, we're going to see less than 5,000 people actually residing in Jerusalem. People are slaughtered. People are taken into exile. People are going to die because of starvation and because of sickness. And so this all takes place in 586. And I think we have the temptation in our church today to take Lamentations and to read it out of context. But what Jerusalem wants us to hear, what Jeremiah wants us to do, is to walk through the pain of Jerusalem. Not to go over it, but to go through it. So that's the when of the physical, but also the why. Something that we find out in the book of Lamentations and leading up to it in the other prophets is that ultimately Jerusalem is not destroyed in 586 BC because of rebelling against Babylon. The reason why they are ultimately destroyed is because they rebel against God. We see this depravity of the people of God in Jerusalem as they are no longer acting like worshipers of God, but instead are acting like worshipers of themselves. They worship other gods. They do things that they are not supposed to do. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they end up saying evil is good and good is evil. And in this moment, God says, enough is enough. You have hurt the poor for too long. You have put the widows to the margins for too long. You have gone against my rules, my principles for too long. And so then God comes through and destroys Jerusalem. Lamentations talks about it in this way, that God is the warrior with the bow who's shooting the arrows. God is the one that is destroying the walls of Jerusalem. God is the one that is no longer hearing their prayers. God is the one that is distant. And so Lamentations does not shy away from the reason why it is being destroyed. It actually acknowledges they have sinned and God has come through. So that's going to be the when of the physical, the why of the physical, but lastly, there's also the how of this physical layer. How is Jerusalem destroyed? And it's important because this is going to show up multiple times throughout the book of Lamentations, that Jerusalem is destroyed by siege. Siege is an ancient way of doing warfare. It's still actually done today, where you surround a city and then you do mainly 3 different tactics in order to conquer that city. One tactic, the first one, is after surrounding the city, you cut off supplies to that city. And so not only is the city having to deal with battle and warfare, but now they're dealing with starvation and dehydration. Food supplies are lacking. Water is waning. Sickness is on the rise because of lack of resources. And so the supplies are cut off. That's going to be the first tactic. The second tactic is going to be that they surround the entire city with a wall and with towers. And there's multiple reasons why that they would do this. One is so that they can actually shoot arrows into the city, which we'll see popping up throughout the book of Lamentations of arrows being shot into the city. It's so that they can also throw big boulders into the city. It's so that they could look over the walls. But ultimately, it was so that if anyone dared try to escape the city, they would be captured, killed, or put into exile, one of the two. And so they surrounded the city. And then third, of course, they infiltrate the city. There are three ways to infiltrate a city in siege warfare. One way is to go over the wall with ladders, which I think sounds pretty fascinating. But they'd put ladders on the wall, they'd climb up, and they'd try to jump into it, which is actually a pretty fast way of infiltrating a city. The second way, though, was actually to dig under the wall. So they would dig. If there was a moat, they try to actually go beneath the moat. If the moat was too strong, then of course they wouldn't do that, but they try to go under the wall to get into the city. And if those ways didn't work, or they didn't want to go with those routes, there was a third way. And that was to go through the city. Just to go through the wall. And this is actually how Jerusalem is conquered. We see Babylon takes a rampart and it destroys the wall, destroys the gates of Jerusalem, and that is how they are able to infiltrate. Something to know with siege warfare is that sieges take a long time. Sieges can last as little as 6 months, but as long as up to 6 years. And we know that when it came to the conquering of Jerusalem, it took about 18 months for them to finally be able to break through the walls and conquer Jerusalem. And so when Lamentations is talking about pain and sorrow, it's not talking about one day going bad. It's about weeks, months, even a year of it seeming like God is against us. God is not here. And so as we explore the book of Lamentations, we have to keep this historical context in mind. So the first layer is physical. The second layer is going to be spiritual. We recognize as we read the book of Lamentations that the people are in need of spiritual renewal. The people are in need of spiritual renewal. What we see is that sin and death have a consequence. It leads to a wilderness-like experience to where people are distant from God. They are no longer in proximity to God. And in not being in proximity to God, this creates chaos. You see throughout the Bible where God is, there's shalom, there's peace. But when God's ways are not being operated, there's chaos. And so there's very much chaos being felt in the city of Jerusalem as they are distant from God, and their actions and God is demonstrating that in destroying the city. And so because of that, Lamentations takes upon itself a certain structure to how it conveys its message. These poems operate with this important word called an acrostic. An acrostic is when a poem takes an alphabet and each verse of the poem goes with the designation or with the designating letter. So, for example, there's 22 verses in chapters 1, 2, and 4 of Lamentations, and the reason why is because there's 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and so it's kind of like this. The first line begins with an A if you're using the English alphabet, and then it goes to B, and then to C, and then it goes all the way to Z. There's probably two reasons why Lamentations decides to use the acrostic as its way of conveying its message and structuring its poem. One reason is to actually bring order into the situation. They are experiencing pain and chaos, and so they're trying to bring order into what they are experiencing. I do this all the time when it comes to my desk. I tell people when they come into my office, if my desk is in shambles, that means my life is in shambles. And so sometimes I try to put my desk into a peaceful way, hoping that my life would also go back into a peaceful moment. And that seems to be what Lamentations is doing, and yet we find out it's not able to do that. I said, for example, chapters 1, 2, and 3 meet this acrostic, but chapter 3 is actually a little bit different. Chapter 3, for example, is going to have 66 verses instead of having 22 verses. So chapter 1, 22 verses, and it meets this acrostic. Chapter 2, 22 verses, meets this acrostic. Chapter 3, it's an acrostic, but it's multiplied and has 66 verses. Chapter 4, 22 verses, meets the acrostic, but you get to chapter 5, it has 22 verses, but it does not meet the acrostic. And I think the reason why is that the poet, Jeremiah, is trying to demonstrate this utter lack of peace and order that they are experiencing. The second reason that Jeremiah most often or most likely will use the acrostic in Lamentations is to signify the intensity of the pain that the people are experiencing. It's almost like they're saying, I'm experiencing so much pain from A to Z. And so this signifies this spiritual lack and this need for God to show up. So we've talked about the physical layer. We've, of course, talked about the spiritual layer, but there's also one more layer that Lamentations will take us through, and that is the emotional layer. A word that repeats itself throughout the book of Lamentations, especially in the opening 2 chapters, is the word comfort. And oftentimes it's used in the negative. There is no one to comfort Jerusalem. No one will console Jerusalem. In the ancient world, one way to offer comfort was to fix the problem, right? We do this today as well. There's a problem and we try to fix it, but there was also another way to offer comfort. What we'll see in this emotional category is that although they structure it like an acrostic, the tone of Lamentations reminds us of a funeral. In particular, a funeral dirge. This is a type of poetry that sits in the sorrow and does not let up in the slightest. But funeral dirges, mourning in the ancient world, was a ritual. And one way to fulfill the ritual was to fix the problem, but the second way to fulfill the ritual was to join in the mourning. There was an expectation in the community. If someone had just lost a loved one to death, you can't fix that problem. But what you can do is come alongside that person and mourn with them. And so as we go through this emotional, mournful moment in the book of Lamentations, and it's asking for comfort, we, the reader, are being invited to join in the mourning, to experience the mourning. And in some sense, we are offering comfort to this heinous moment that is going on in the life of Jerusalem. Lamentations cries out for comfort, and in some sense, we are answering its call to listen to the cry and to cry along with them. Lamentations, folks, is a hard book. It is one that does not just show us pain and sorrow, it is one that wants us to feel sorrow. It invites us not just to see it, but ultimately to share the sorrow, to be with the people in the moment. There are times where we want Lamentations to let up, to just talk about hope, to just be happy, to give thanks to God, and yet Lamentations never will. And I think this is God's intention. He wants us to know that there are moments in life where all we can do is just sit in the silence and experience the pain. Lamentations offers us no answers. All it asks is questions, and it gives us a practice. And that practice is the practice of lament. And maybe the reason why God wants us to have this practice of mourning and lamenting in a spiritual worshiping way is that we will experience moments where we have no answers and we have no idea how to respond. And yet God invites us to come into conversation with him and to lament. I said at the very beginning of this session that Lamentations is in the business of discipling us, making us look more like God, making us look more like Jesus. And here is what I think it makes us, or how it makes us look more like Jesus. In the book of Lamentations, after we recognize the physical lack, the spiritual lack, and the emotional lack, it develops a heart of the reader to have compassion for those who are broken and those who are the breakers, realizing that everyone is in need. In some sense, we become more like Jesus, who sits at the cross, who stands at the cross, who hangs at the cross, and looks down upon the people who have actually hung him up there themselves. And he says, "Forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they are doing." It's that type of heart Lamentations can develop in us for both the broken and the breaker, realizing that we are all in need. And so, in Lamentations, we share the sorrow. We reach out to God and we ask the Lord, "Lord, will you restore us physically?" We share the sorrow and we reach out to God and we ask God, "Will you restore us spiritually?" We share the sorrow and we reach out to God and we say, "Lord, will you restore us emotionally?" So let us, with God, not go over sorrow. Let us not go under sorrow, but with God and with Lamentations, let us go through the sorrow.